It came to my attention that a man by the name of Keysar was entertaining the notion of becoming a federal MP. He said he'd had discussions with a friend in the Liberal Party, but nothing eventuated. I say, thank goodness for that, and you'll understand why by the end of this speech. But what concerns me more, Mr Deputy President, is that it was reported that the Labor Party allegedly spent 8 months in discussions with Mr Trad about him becoming a Labor candidate. After 8 months, I hope that the Labor Party have actually closed the door for good on Mr Trad being a Labor candidate. I hope they've closed the door, they've bolted it, they've locked it, and I hope they've thrown away the key. Now, of course, whom the Labor Party pre-select to be one of their representatives is entirely up to them. But the fact that Mr Trad said the Labor Party talked with him for 8 months says something about the culture within the ALP. I wonder if the ALP managed in 8 months to find out what I did about Mr Trad in about 8 minutes, namely that Mr Keysar is wholly unsuitable to be a Member of Parliament or recognised by any other organisation as a community leader of any sort. Now, I know that these are very strong comments, and I bear no personal ill will towards Mr Trad, but if he wants to try and become a representative of the Australian people, then we are completely entitled, and it is completely fair to examine his track record, his opinions, his views, and establish his character. And I do not need to make any substantial assessment of this myself. I only need to report the findings of the New South Wales Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal. In 2009, the New South Wales Supreme Court found that Mr Trad, and I quote, incites people to commit acts of violence, incites people to have racist attitudes, and is a dangerous and disgraceful individual. Now, this stemmed from a defamation case that Mr Trad brought against Harbour Radio. In 2011, the New South Wales Court of Appeal actually overturned this initial ruling after Mr Trad appealed it. But late last year, that same court, the New South Wales Court of Appeal, overturned its own 2011 ruling, dismissing Mr Trad's appeal and upholding the Supreme Court's ruling regarding the aforementioned circumstances. Mr Trad was also ordered to pay Harbour Radio's costs in the appeals court. So let me take a moment of the Senate's time to detail the evidence that supported the court's findings. In finding that Mr Trad incites people to commit acts of violence, the courts based that on the following evidence, namely that Mr Trad's own website used to have a link to another website he touted as having very good articles concerning Islam and Muslims. But the courts found that this other website held significant anti-Semitic views. The judge simply did not believe Mr Trad's denials that he didn't know about the nature of this website. And in terms of him saying that the site had very good articles, court documents reveal that Mr Trad, and I quote, agreed he had little choice but to concede that this was an endorsement of what was plainly a racist website. And when interviewed by a journalist, Mr Trad said words to the effect of, "There are many Jews who question how many died in the Holocaust," which the judge saw as an attempt to diminish the significance of those events. In the end, both courts deemed that this showed that Mr Keysar incited violence against Jewish people. Both courts also agreed that Mr Trad incited people to have racist attitudes, given their previous conclusion that he incited people to commit acts of violence due to his support for sources that were anti-Semitic. Justice McClellan, in the 2009 findings, said that he was satisfied that the plaintiff does hold views which can properly be described as racist. He continued. He said, "I'm also satisfied that he encourages others to hold these views. In particular, he holds views derogatory of Jewish people." Now, I put it to you, Mr Deputy President, how could any party think that this was a person suited for a federal parliamentary career. Someone with views like that could be discovered in 8 minutes of Google searching, and yet this man was courted by the ALP by his own admission for 8 months. Does Australia really want someone in Parliament who has been found by 2 courts to incite violence and racism? But I only wish it could stop there, because that's not all. Mr Tradd has also been found to be a disgraceful individual by the New South Wales Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal. His comments on a number of issues led the court to state, any form of incitement to violence of a kind reasonably described as antisocial would satisfy such a standard. So would incitement to racist attitudes and the statements relating to homosexuals and homosexuality and the trivialisation of rape. And then, of course, there's the finding that Mr Tradd is a dangerous individual. Surely not a glowing reference for any prospective parliamentarian. And this was based on the following opinions of Mr Tradd. When talking about the gang rape of young women in Sydney by a group of Lebanese men, in one interview Mr Tradd chose to tell a joke and describe these types of perpetrators as stupid young boys. The court said that his comments about the issue demeaned the victims of the crime, did not condemn the perpetrators and trivialised the responsibility of the rapists. And if that wasn't enough, Mr Tradd did not condemn Sheikh Hilal's disgraceful comments about women being uncovered meat in a speech about rape, and instead Mr Tradd actually chose to defend that speech and the Sheikh's comments. Mr Tradd also failed to condemn the Sheikh's reference to the blessings of the 11th of September and the Sheikh's condoning of the use of boys as martyrs in the cause of radical Islam. The court said that this involved putting forward ideas which risk an unbalanced or fanatical person being encouraged or encouraging others to participate in such activities. The courts were right to be concerned about the reach of Mr Tradd's opinions, given that many of his abhorrent views were in the public domain. The appeal court concluded there is support for the conclusion that the appellant was properly described as a dangerous individual in circumstances where the views he expressed were capable of influencing others, were intended to influence others, and would have a receptive audience in some, if limited, quarters. These factors, combined with the respects in which he incited others to violence and racist attitudes, being a person with a public presence and influence in some quarters, fully supported the characterisation of the appellant as a dangerous individual. I put it to the Senate and to the Australian people. How could any reasonable person or any reasonable political party consider endorsing a person that holds these views to become a member of the Australian Parliament? How could a party, like the Labor Party, be in discussions with this man for 8 months, as was reported in the media? Did they fail to do any research into his character during this time? And I have to ask, how many sections of the media and the community endorse this man as a national spokesman for the Islamic community? It is just beyond all reasonable comprehension. Because beyond the findings, Mr Deputy President, of the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, although those findings are damning enough, I have to say, there are many other instances of Mr Tradd's questionable views. Mr Tradd, of course, has openly advocated for polygamy in Australia through the Sydney Morning Herald, asking why should polygamy be a crime. He's not shy about seeking changes to our laws and our customs. He says, and I quote, "Monogamy is great, but it's clearly not for everyone. Islam openly acknowledges this fact of human nature and stipulates a regulatory framework for plural relations." Although I must note that Mr Tradd draws the line at polyandry because he's not too keen to permit a wife to take more than one husband. And it begs the question, where are all the equality advocates in the Labor Party when it comes to that? And of course, Mr Tradd's challenge to Australian law doesn't stop there. He's also publicly spoken about Sharia law in Australia, arguing the yes case for separate Islamic courts to deal with divorce. In the Daily Telegraph he wrote that, and saying that there is support for parts of Sharia law that deal with marriage and inheritance without the penal aspects. Now, such calls, of course, run counter to the views of most Australians, including legal commentators former judges, former Labor ministers, and even our own Prime Minister, who advocate one law for all. Again, I ask, what was the Labor Party thinking? Reportedly engaging someone who has views completely at odds with what I thought were their own on something as important as our legal system. Now, some of Mr Tradd's views on terrorism might not sit well with many Australians either. In 2005, he wrote an article published in the Daily Telegraph that said Australians should be more concerned with the United States than with radical Islam. He said radical Islam, while an anathema to Islam itself, is made up of no more than a bunch of ragtag Dad's Army types fighting for their own survival. Justice McClellan took a slightly different view. He said, to downplay radical Islam and suggest it's no more than a ragtag Dad's Army types fighting for their own survival would not be acceptable to the Australian community. The plaintiff was effectively suggesting the United States of America presented a greater threat than radical Islam to the Australian people. Let me repeat that again. Mr Tradd was effectively suggesting the United States of America was more dangerous to the Australian people than the radical Islamists. It is just extraordinary. And Justice McClellan was spot on when he said, this stance would, in my view, be entirely repugnant to the overwhelming majority of people in the Australian community. And a year after the September 11 terrorist attacks on the US, Mr Tradd was reported in the Weekend Australian as saying, Osama bin Laden would have trouble teaching someone to drive a car. How could a man living in a backward country mastermind the hijacking of several planes with the whole operation going off like clockwork? I just don't want to believe Muslims were behind it. That's Mr Tradd. These views were, again, unacceptable to the New South Wales Supreme Court judge, who branded this an extraordinary statement and said the Australian community would not accept these views. The judge said Osama bin Laden claimed responsibility for September 11. A suggestion that the terrorist act was not perpetrated by adherents to Islam would not be accepted by Australians, whatever their ethnic origin or religious views. And if Mr Tradd is so concerned about good relations between various groups within Australia, why then does he write about the criminal dregs of white society, and why does he refer to Indian people as cow worshippers? This hardly sounds like the views of someone that would represent the opinions of mainstream Australians. And yet, according to Mr Tradd, the Labor Party were in pre-selection discussions with him for 8 months. 8 months, Mr Deputy President. Yet these are the views that he holds, and he has no problem spouting them off to any journalist who approaches him. For years, he has been the media's go-to man on any number of matters. He's described as, and I quote, Sydney Muslim community leader, even after he left the employ of Sheikh Halali and the Lebanese Muslim associations. And given the court's finding about Mr Tradd's opinions, shouldn't that alone be just a little alarming? What does this say about some parts of our media? To consider that this is a man that journalists have been going to for years as an authoritative voice of the Australian Muslim community. It simply beggars belief. I cannot believe that Australian Muslims would be happy with having him as their spokesman. He truly has done a massive disservice to the Muslim community when you consider the findings that are detailed here tonight. But I want to be very clear here, Mr Deputy President. You can't be an advocate for free speech without conceding there are going to be people who hold objectionable views and views that differ from your own. Having a difference of opinion shouldn't preclude people from being part of the parliamentary process. It should be open to all Australians. Now, I want to put on the record, and I think it's very clear, I absolutely disagree with Mr Tradd's views that I've outlined tonight, but they are his words, and they are the words of the judgments that have been rendered against him. But what I find most galling is that the once proud Labor Party reportedly, at Mr Tradd's own admission, entertained for 8 months, the idea of having this man as a candidate for political office. And for years, the media have lauded him as a national spokesman on Islamic matters. Tonight, I have sought to lay bare the words and opinions of someone who seeks to become an elected representative of the Australian people. Although by all accounts, Mr Tradd is completely unconcerned about what party will take him into Parliament. But I think it is completely reasonable that anyone seeking such a position should have their public opinions examined. And it is now up to the Australian people, and it is up to the political parties in this country to determine for themselves whether they would like someone of Mr Tradd's character representing them in the Australian Parliament.
Thank you, Senator Bernardi. Senator O'Neill.